Dispatches one of his top team to China. Will they have to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses to save the planet? Also tonight, how lockdown has exacerbated eating disorders.
I would go to bed at night and be like, you know what, I just don't want to wake up in the morning.
And loo roll, used masks and hand sanitizer. What would you put in a museum of COVID? Hello, good evening. One of the first decisive moves Joe Biden made as US president was to rejoin the Paris climate deal. The second was to create a post of special presidential envoy that signalled how seriously the US was taking climate change. He appointed former US Secretary of State John Kerry. Now Kerry's heading to Shanghai to woo China in advance of a virtual climate summit President Biden is hosting next week. A simple diplomatic trip if relations between the two nations were cordial, but while the US wants to engage on the future of the planet, it's also been condemning the Chinese government for its crackdown in Hong Kong and its human rights abuses in Xinjiang. What's clear is that without an agreement between the world's greatest polluters, there's little chance of averting dangerous climate change. What's less clear is how you engage with China on climate change, but still manage to criticise it meaningfully on its human rights record. Tonight we explore where those lines are and how President Biden will attempt to bridge them. Here's Alim Makbul.
China and the United States are by far the two biggest polluters in the world, together accounting for a staggering 40% of global carbon emissions. Bringing down the rate of global warming clearly needs sizable, urgent commitments from both. But each accuses the other of not doing enough, even last year producing rival reports on each other's climate transgressions. And of late, their relations have become more strained in so many other ways, as illustrated by last month's ill-tempered and decidedly undiplomatic summit in Alaska. The Chinese saying the US had no right to talk down to them, the US openly attacking Beijing's human rights record. Specifically, the Biden administration formally defined China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims as genocide and has talked in strong terms about mass detention and sterilization of minorities, in spite of what the world is shown in state-organized tours. But having said all of that, the US is now sending its special envoy, former Secretary of State John Kerry, to Shanghai to talk climate change.
As the president has said, the climate issue is a freestanding issue. It's not for trade against the other critical differences that we have with China right now. Everybody's familiar with them in the economy, economic issues, certain issues of rights and other issues. But those have got to be channeled separately. Climate is about the survival of the planet.
After what's perceived to have been crucial time lost on the environment during the Donald Trump years, many climate scientists are pleased with the promise of engagement, anything that helps. But those who've been carefully gauging China's reaction to the new US administration find John Kerry's assertion naive.
The US government is going to face some headwinds when they go to China to have these conversations, because what China has been very clear about is that they don't view the climate and energy relationship with the United States in isolation. And so I think that the United States is going to have to, in parallel, work with China on many of these issues, get everything out on the open, rebuild the trust, and try to think of a constructive path forward.
But if rebuilding trust means not mentioning to President Xi China's treatment of Uyghurs, his country's human rights abuses in Hong Kong, the cyber attacks it carries out, its threats and military posturing towards Taiwan, is there really a way of working together on the environment? Even some ardent proponents of a tough stance suggest there is.
We are actually all trying to do the same thing, and so it makes sense to talk about how we seek to achieve that together. That's not the same as supporting the government. You know, let's not forget that even during the dark days of the apartheid regime in South Africa, we actually worked together on nuclear disarmament, and South Africa became a post-nuclear state.
There are fears among some human rights activists that any engagement with China could be turned around and used as something of a publicity coup by China. Do you have that fear?
Well, I'm sure that that will be tried, but it will be tried in the context of the Biden administration having repeated its predecessors' comments that China is committing genocide. And so, you know, Secretary Kerry or indeed Envoy Kerry is now the representative of a government that has declared that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in one of the worst crimes possible by a state actor.
The impact on the rest of us of the environmental policies of Beijing and Washington is profound. China has made a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2060, but evidently some countries are always perhaps just too big, too powerful to put pressure on to deliver.
I'm joined now by UN advisor Jeffrey Sachs, who's also the director of the Earth Institute, which looks at how to promote the mitigation of human-induced climate change, and the lawyer and human rights activist Teng Biao, who's exiled from China and is now a professor at Hunter College in New York. Jeffrey, if I can begin with you, the Biden administration has been strongly critical of China's actions on human rights, but engaging on climate change. Do you see that as a strategy that can actually work?
I'm not sure why BBC started with listing only China's human rights abuses. What about America's human rights abuses? The Iraq War, together with the UK, completely illegal and under false pretenses. The war in Syria, the war in Libya, the continued sanctions against civilian populations in Venezuela and Iran, walking away from the Paris Climate Agreement for the last 4 years, unilateral trade actions that have been deemed illegal by WTO. So one can make anything one wants, but we have really serious human rights violations by the United States abroad, not to mention an insurrection on January 6th in our own country, not to mention the continued massive racism, white supremacism, and abuse of incarceration of hundreds of thousands of people in the US, Black, African-American, people of color. So I think that the whole premise of this story is a little bit odd.
No, but sorry, I'm looking. We have to look. If I may, we have to look.
I found the framing of it not what I expected. I thought we were going to talk about climate change, which we should. But I think that the idea that there is one party that is so guilty, how can we talk to them, is just a strange way to address this issue.
Well, hang on. Sorry, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, if I could come, Jeffrey, I'm hoping we can have a conversation. I'm hoping we can have a conversation. And if I could just say, I'm using, and what I'm saying back to you here is, we're also using the framing of the Biden administration. We're also talking from the perspective of how Joe Biden himself and those around him have talked about the human rights abuses in China. So you know, sorry, just to say,
always, excuse me for one moment, the U.S. always attacks other countries. It holds itself sacrosanct. It's really outrageous, because I know what goes on in American foreign policy, and I know how abusive it is, and I know what it's like to live in a racist society, which I happen to do, where a significant part of this country is racist, followed a racist president who led an insurrection on the Capitol. And so the framing of this issue is strange. That's what I'm saying.
What, by your own country as well as the rest of the world? I believe
by the government, not by my own country, by the government of my country. So I believe that the two leading polluters absolutely need to clean up their act. This is crucial for the sake of the world. And so, of course, we need to clean up our act, because the United States is emitting 15 tons of CO2 per person in this country, twice what China is emitting per capita. And the two countries together are about 40% of the CO2 emissions in the world, and we are wrecking the climate.
Jeffrey, I'm keen to bring in Teng at this point, and I'll come back to some of your points in just a moment, because of course, Teng, you are exiled yourself. You have actually been through. You've had the experience of being kidnapped and detained by Chinese authorities. I wonder what you make of what Jeffrey's saying there, of the framing of this, and whether you think America and China could and should work together.
Yeah, what Professor Sachs just said is exactly the Communist Party's narrative strategy. Every time when the United States criticizes the human rights abuse in China, the Chinese government said, look at your country and look at your racism. Look at in history you killed Indians, Native Americans. So that's a political whataboutism. That's really misleading. America is not detaining more than 1 million Uyghurs, not killing a whole people. That's really different human rights violation. I criticize Americans racism or other social justice issues, but that's really different level. And the Chinese government is committing a genocide in Xinjiang, and Chinese government is breaking its international commitment all the time.
So I mean, are you offended by what you've just heard there? The idea that you can equate the two as someone who has been detained and kidnapped?
So I myself was detained and kidnapped and tortured, and many of my friends are still in prison in China. And one thing related to this is China never keep its promise. China signed and ratified more than 25 international human rights treaties, like a Convention Against Torture. But torture is rampant. I myself was tortured. So how can you expect China will keep its commitment in terms of climate change?
So it doesn't.
And Chinese government doesn't care about climate change, and it doesn't care about human rights. Can you imagine a regime like committing a genocide cares about the fate of this planet?
Teng, let's put that back to Jeffrey. You just heard from Teng there saying, from his point of view and also his experience, what's gone on there, that you shouldn't be equating the two. But on that bigger point, which is what you came on to talk about predominantly, the environment and climate change, Teng saying there that the Chinese authorities do not care about it.
I find this discussion absolutely bizarre. Shall we talk about the U.S. Dropping bombs and flying U.S. warplanes over Yemen, creating mass destruction right now? Shall we talk about how many people have died in Iraq because of the U.S. illegal actions? There are so many wonderful, important things to talk about. They really are.
Well, sorry, I did just ask you about the environment. If you could answer that question about China.
This is such a strange framing. Of course, China abides by treaties. The United States walked out of most of the treaties recently. The United States walked out of the Iran treaty that was approved by the UN Security Council and by the UN member states, and then unilaterally imposed sanctions on the civilian population of Iran to bring as much suffering as possible. That is an absolute abuse.
But there is a new administration. There is a new administration now, which is what happens.
That's good.
And so just bringing us up to date, which is what I'm trying to do. I take your point there that we've got to talk about what America has also done, whether there's equivocation here, Teng Biao just described what you were saying as whataboutery, and you're parroting the line of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes, but
he is allowed his view of your view.
Of course, and I'm allowed to completely disagree.
You have, but I am keen.
No, it's not about whatism. It's about how we are going. It's about how we are going to get along on this planet.
From what you have said, it doesn't sound like you think the Chinese should, because as you rightly say, of what America has been doing for the last 4 years, it doesn't sound like you believe the Chinese should trust the Americans over a climate change deal. Is that right?
I believe that the framing of this story of how can the U.S. trust China is bizarre.
But sorry, I did just ask you a question.
I think that the Chinese and the U.S. should sit down for serious talks, and then they can forge a pathway, as they did in 2015, to reach the Paris Climate Agreement. and then China stayed in the Paris Climate Agreement, and Donald Trump, a psychopath as president of the United States, walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So let's get the framing right.
Okay, but some of your fellow Americans, in fact, millions and millions of them who just voted for Donald Trump again, wouldn't necessarily agree with your characterization.
I'm telling you that this is a problematic country. And therefore, for one country or for your story to be saying that this is all about how can one trust China is really bizarre.
A point you have made repeatedly, and we were trying to get more onto the environment there and what should happen next, which you did come to.
And
Jeffrey Sachs, we have used up all our time. And I'm sorry to say that, but thank you.
The two countries successfully agreed on Paris in 2015. We should build on that.
An important point, Jeffrey Sachs, thank you for your time. Teng Biao, thank you to you.